Think about experiments and causal claims. In the last video, you saw that correlations are difficult to make causal claims about. And so it's hard to say whether some of the conclusions that researchers and journalists want to make really can be drawn from them. When we're establishing causality, we're thinking about these three different factors: covariance, temporal precedence, and internal validity. We've been talking about them for the last several chapters. So we're just, this isn't anything new, but it's a different way of looking at the world. So I want to just make sure that you're there with me. So experiments establish covariance. Our independent variables say, help us answer the question, compared to what, right? So we often have a comparison group, laptop and writing by hand, or effort and no effort. We often are able to say what happened in the treatment group relative to the control group. So we have covariance. We have control groups, treatment groups, maybe comparison groups. We may not have both control groups and a different kind of comparison group. So control group is a no treatment condition, or maybe a placebo condition, as in the Zimmer research, where Zimmer gave people either ivermectin or a placebo. Treatment groups, we have at least two treatment conditions, or at least two conditions, and one of those is an active treatment, perhaps, and the other is a comparison group of some sort. And placebo group, we're given something that is not active. And generally, we're looking for an active placebo, perhaps a caffeine pill, so that the person who's consuming the placebo thinks that they might have gotten the treatment. Let's think about temporal precedence. The causal variable precedes the effect variable. So, for example, with modeled persistence. Now, we talked earlier this term about the skull horn experiment, and the researchers, Scherer and Sayers, argued that talking on cell phones caused this protrusion from the brain, or from the skull, or skull horns. The problem is they weren't randomly assigning people to groups. They weren't measuring beforehand and then measuring afterwards. There wasn't, any way of establishing temporal precedence in that study. Now, our third factor is internal validity. With internal validity, we are getting rid of third variables or confounds. So perhaps, with some studies that we've talked about, it's not clear that something else wasn't going on. So for example, the COVID in schools, it might have been that these, our schools with more masking also we're doing other kinds of things. It also might be that there are some sort of selection effects. And so we're trying to remove those that might have caused that. Now we're going to talk about design confounds more over the next couple of chapters. But design confounds are when we have two different things happening at the same time. So for example, perhaps you have assigned people to two different groups, but because of the way that you assigned to those groups, maybe there are more women in one group, or maybe they're older. And as a result, it's unclear what your effect is due to. So what we want is to ask whether the variability in the study is systematic or unsystematic. So, in general, we should be seeing, we should see that it doesn't really matter how these children got assigned to groups, that there are children who can't sit still and those who can, those who need a nap and those who don't. And they're all in that study, and there's no systematic difference between those two groups. So we're really trying to make the two groups as similar as possible beforehand. And we'll talk about some other ways of doing that over the next couple of weeks. Sometimes we're going to see selection effects. So Lovas, who did research with children with autism and attempting to build social and cognitive kinds of skills in these children, found significant differences between normal treatment is as usual, and this more intensive treatment. Pretty amazing. And for those of you who have family members with autism, you can imagine how people responded to this research. The difficulty is that he really wasn't doing any sort of random assignment. So they were opting into one group or another. And you can imagine that those people in the treatment as usual group might have chosen that group because they didn't have to travel as far. Okay. And so as you are thinking about studies, part of what you want to be thinking about is there another explanation? And if there is, that's a problem. So one way of avoiding selection effects is to match the groups. So perhaps you're matching on QPA, and your top two scores, one goes to group 1, the other goes to group 2. Your next two on GPA. Okay, and on, right? That's one way of doing it. You decide which variables are potentially problematic, and you just match those two groups on those variables. And we're going to stop here, and I'll see you in our next video where we begin talking about independent groups and independent group designs. Take care.